This is the Battle of Oriskany. Battle of Oriskany took place August 6th, 1777. A very small in scale battle that had big effects and was a contributing factor to the Americans' fabulous victory at Saratoga 2 months later. Now, in 1777, the British decided that their strategy would be to try to isolate the what they felt was the hotbed of the American Revolution by isolating New England and especially Boston from the rest of the colonies. The idea being that they would just concentrate on defeating New England and Boston, and then everything else would just fall into place, and they could the rest of the colonies would capitulate without too much trouble. To accomplish this goal of theirs, they decided they would have General John Burgoyne come from Canada, come down the Lake Champlain, Lake George, and Great Carrying Place Portage to the Hudson River, and then down to Albany. This army under Burgoyne would be met by forces under General William Howe coming up from New York City. They would unite in the Albany area. To protect their western flank, they would have Brevetted General Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger go to Oswego and come from Oswego down the Oswego River to Lake Oneida, to Wood Creek, to the Portage, to the Mohawk River, to the Hudson River near Albany, and he would hook up with the other two armies, and this move would protect Burgoyne's right flank or western flank. So on June 23rd, St. Ledger left Lachine, Canada, and headed towards Oswego. He had with him about 750 men. And the one small fly in the ointment, if you will, from the British point of view, was that St. Ledger's route was sort of blocked by Fort Stanwix. Fort Stanwix was a fort built by the British in 1758 during the French and Indian War, and it guarded the portage from Wood Creek to the Mohawk River. About a 6-mile portage there. And this, by the way, is an ancient route that the Indians would use, and you could go by canoe from the New York City area all the way up the Hudson River, the Mohawk River, through this portage towards Wood Creek to Lake Oneida, down the Oswego River, and out into Lake Ontario and points west. Fort Stanwix stood at this 6-mile portage. Now, the British believed that this fort was very lightly manned, old and rickety, and would not really be a problem, that barely have to pause in their travels. Well, they were quite wrong about that. And the Americans had reinforced this fort, and it was now led by Lieutenant Colonel Peter Gansevoort, and he had 750 men, not the 70 men that the British had previously thought. He had 750 Continental Regulars, American Patriot Forces, regular army from New York and Massachusetts. On August 2nd, St. Ledger arrived at Fort Stanwix with his forces. And while he had been at Oswego, his scouts had told him about the Americans reinforcing Fort Stanwix. So he enrolled a number of Iroquois Indians who were allied with the British under Joseph Brant, Chief Joseph Brant, who was a Mohawk. And so he had added about 600 or more Mohawk Indians. So St. Ledger at that point had with him between 1,500 and 1,700 men when he arrived to set up a siege of Fort Stanwix. Now, St. Ledger's move had been discovered by American spies and scouts, particularly in the Mohawk Valley. And 30 miles away from Fort Stanwix, in Tryon County, was Fort Dayton along the Mohawk River. And to guard against and the British movement and to relieve the siege that St. Ledger had set up around Fort Stanwix, they called in the militia. Now, militia are amateurs, non-professional volunteers. And this group, the Tryon County Militia, was ordered to assemble. Their leader was General Nicholas Herkimer. These men were farmers, tradesmen, bringing their own weapons. They drilled now and then, but they were far from professional soldiers. And on August 4th, Herkimer left Fort Dayton and moved up a road that existed at that point towards Fort Stanwix to help Gansevoort defend Fort Stanwix from the British. On August 5th, Herkimer was camped in a small Oneida Indian village called Oriskany. He was about 6 miles from Fort Stanwix at that point. Now, St. Ledger, who was currently besieging Fort Stanwix, learned about Herkimer's men, and he organized a relief force to go and set up an ambush and to hopefully destroy Herkimer's relief force. On August 6th, this force, the British force, which consisted of quite a number of the Iroquois Indians, as well as some British loyalist forces, they had set up their ambush in a ravine. The road to Fort Stanwix went through this deep ravine. In the bottom of the ravine, where it was quite swampy, was a small stream called Battle Brook, now called Battle Brook. And then the ravine goes up here. The British had set up and hidden their men in a kind of a U-shaped formation, and the idea being to allow the Americans under Herkimer to get all the way into the ravine and starting up the other side, and then shut the back door and have them completely surrounded. Now, a trait that I've noticed in my research over the years of Native Americans is impatience. And that trait, there are many examples of it, and that trait reared its head this day. About 10 a.m. on August 6, 1777, General Herkimer was in this area and was starting up the other side of the ravine when a number of the British Allied Indians attacked prematurely. This was before the total American force got within the trap. So approximately 200 of the Americans escaped out the back end of this trap, and many of the British Allied Indians went chasing after them. In the meantime, the forces that remained, the British and the Americans, were engaged in a ferocious and sometimes hand-to-hand fight in the ravine and on the hillside. Now, one of the first people to get shot was General Herkimer. He got a shot in the leg. That shot killed his horse, and his men wanted him to retire from this fight. but General Herkimer would have none of it. He got his men to carry him up to a beech tree where he could see what was going on. They lit his pipe, and he continued to direct his men. Now, the nature of this, as I mentioned, was a ferocious battle. After about an hour, a sudden rainstorm popped up. Now, this rainstorm caused a halt in the fighting. Why? Because both the American militia, the Tri-County militia, and the British forces were using flintlock rifles or flintlock muskets. And they don't function if it's raining out, because the powder in the flash pan gets wet and the guns won't go boom. So there was like a halftime in the battle. During this timeout, Herkimer had noticed that a lot of his men were getting killed when the Indians in particular would see his men shoot, and then they would attack them before they could reload. So during the rain, Herkimer ordered his men to pair up. And so one of the pair would always have a loaded rifle or musket, while the other one was loading, and they would never be both unloaded at the same time. Also, about this time, word of this ferocious resistance being put up by the Americans had reached St. Ledger, and he sent, who was back at Fort Stanwix, and he sent a few more men to try to reinforce his forces against the Americans. And these men turned their coats inside out, their uniforms inside out, so hopefully the Americans would not notice them as being British. This did not work, and these men were rudely attacked. So the rainstorm stopped, and the battle resumed. Now, also, while all this was going on in this ravine and on the hillside, and according to a plan that had originally been set up by General Herkimer, a man named Marinus Willett led some American forces out of Fort Stanwix and attacked the now almost vacated British camps and British and Indian camps around the fort. Most of them were down near Oriskany. These Americans, they captured a few of the British, captured a lot of supplies, including ammunition, food, clothing, and what they couldn't take back into the fort with them, they destroyed. And so back at the ravine again, word of this attack by the Americans at Fort Stanwix was also getting to the Indians. And in addition to the fact that they were sick of fighting these stubborn Americans who were fighting and giving as good as they were getting, they began to drift back towards the fort. And as they got back towards the fort, the non-Indian British forces at the ravine, they couldn't hold this without their British allies. And so they started drifting back to the fort. And that more or less brought an end to the Battle of Oriskany. The Americans, who were badly beat up, maintained control of the battlefield. The British, who were also badly beat up, and especially their Indian allies, had taken a lot of hits. They were going back to their camps, which were around Fort Stanwix. They, arriving there and realizing that their camp had been destroyed, their food had been either taken or destroyed, their clothing in some cases had been taken and destroyed, a lot of the Indians got very discouraged and began heading home. But St. Ledger wasn't about to give up just yet, and he maintained his siege. Meanwhile, the Americans back at Oriskany, the Battle of Oriskany, they kind of limped back to Fort Dayton. So At that point, another relief force was organized, of volunteers, was organized at Fort Dayton. And this time, it was going to be led by a volunteer, a Major General named Benedict Arnold. Yes, that Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold began making his way with, also, he had about 800 men, towards Fort Stanwix. And along the way, he had cleverly allowed the British to believe that he had about 3,000 men, which of course he didn't. He had 800. But this word that he was coming with about 3,000 men got back to St. Ledger. St. Ledger, back at the fort, his siege was not going well. His relief force had been terribly beat up and were back with him. The Indians were deserting him and going home, and he was about to be vastly outnumbered by Benedict Arnold's forces. At least he thought he was. So St. Ledger packed up his men and retreated all the way back into Canada. This wing of the British strategy, St. Ledger's move, was a complete failure. And several months later, after 2 battles at Saratoga, and getting no help from St. Ledger, and actually getting no help from General Howe in New York City either, John Burgoyne was surrounded by American forces led by the regular army, General Horatio Gates. And Burgoyne had no alternative but to surrender to General Gates. This was a phenomenal achievement by the Americans. A ragtag group of Americans had defeated the British regular army, and the Battle of Oriskany and the Tryon County militia had contributed mightily to this victory by the Americans. Right after Burgoyne surrendered to Gates, the world realized and could see, and the Americans realized and could see, that the Americans could beat the British regular army. At that time, the best trained, best equipped army in the world. France immediately joined the war on our side, on the Patriot side, and contributed mightily to our eventual victory over the British by giving us supplies, men, leadership, and then most importantly, a naval presence. So this little battle in this ravine in Oriskany contributed to a world history-changing event, the Battle of Saratoga, Battles of Saratoga. And thankfully, New York State has purchased the land, and you can go visit the site, Battle of Oriskany State Historic Site. In our next video, we will take you on a tour of that phenomenal little place. Thank you.